Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I give a hearty welcome to our bleary-eyed audience this morning, or perhaps some of you are bleary-eyed. This morning we have Clint Watts, who is our distinguished research fellow at FPRI and a national security analyst for NBC, but most importantly has been the director of our FIE 2020, Foreign Interference in the Election 2020 project, looking at foreign influence and disinformation operations to disrupt and influence our election in the United States. Joining him is Rachel Chernaskey, who's the project manager for this project and who is also a formerly worked as managing editor at Philadelphia Magazine and as a reporter. Both Clint and Rachel publish and are prolific in major publications. And I won't take a lot of time because I think most of you know them already. And so I'll just turn it over to Clint and Rachel to tell us and make sense of what we have been seeing, what we saw, and what is yet to come. Before I do that though, let me just say a quick thank you to our members and our partners for your support. We couldn't do without you. Housekeeping. Put your questions and start adding them right away in the Q&A box. And if you have the chat, don't put them in chat. Chat's used for if you have a technical issue you'd like to share with us. We'll also perhaps be putting some information for you in the chat box, but put your questions in the Q&A. We'll also be recording this. So if you want to view it again, we'll be sending out a video, or if you missed a little bit of it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Clint. Clint, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Raleigh. And so thanks to everybody for showing up this morning. And another day where we don't know what's happening, which has been super interesting. Rachel and I did put together just like a couple of snapshots of some of the interesting things that happened yesterday. And we'll talk just a little bit about the foreign influence angle to start. So it's been pretty fascinating to watch how the institutions, at least at the US government level, have really done pretty well in terms of fighting off foreign interference and disinformation this time around. And by that, I would say we didn't see a major cyber interference effort on or immediately before Election Day. I haven't seen any reports of hacks at polling places or voter rolls like we did in 2016. At the same point, we saw those provocations from Iran a couple weeks back where they had sent out the targeted sort of spam emails to voters trying to impersonate the Proud Boys. We didn't see anything really like that yesterday either. And what we did learn as of last night is I think CBS News had reported that US Cyber Command had been doing offensive cyber operations of some sort against Russia and Iran in the lead up to Election Day. And so it seems to be a repeat of what they did in 2018 with the midterm elections. And so that's a really positive sign. It shows that the U.S. is taking very forward sort of engagement to try and fend off and defend from foreign interference on a cyber level. Same way with disinformation. This morning, some of the Iranian websites that used to push a lot of disinformation, one of them you may have even stumbled into is called the American Herald Tribune, which is actually an Iranian influence outlet. Was taken offline and the FBI and Department of Justice took it down. And so that's a really positive sign in terms of defending against interference. What is very clear is Russia is super quick on the draw to amplify chaos and confusion surrounding vote counts and in terms of mobilizations. And that's really, Rachel and I are almost just shifting our focus today to see how both foreign and domestic groups talk about mobilizations to violence, and we'll come back to that in a minute. One of the things that was interesting yesterday, and I would add all the way back to the weekend, is on Sunday, some of you might have seen that Dr. Atlas of the White House COVID response was on Russia Today, claimed that he did not know. He was very derogatory towards US government institutions. Then he claimed that he didn't know he was on Russia Today. which is a little confusing. But then again, Rudy Giuliani yesterday was on Russia Today on election day. And this is another one of those concerning things, that the bridge really this time around for bringing in foreign disinformation comes directly through the candidates' surrogates to a degree, and direct, mailings to Capitol Hill and some specific Americans who have advanced in the U.S. audience space. So that was a sad sort of moment to watch, especially for us that have been watching foreign disinformation. For those of you that do not know, when Rudy Giuliani was in Ukraine, he was routinely seen with a guy named Andrei Derkach. Andrei Derkach was designated by the Treasury Department last month as a Russian agent in Ukraine. And he has been part of some of the conspiracies, not all of them, but some of the conspiracies you see around Burisma and Hunter Biden. So a little bit sad to see that, but it's also something institutions can't really defend against. Separate, I would say that the tech companies did a pretty good job yesterday of taking down conspiracies around mail-in ballots and voter fraud and election machines being down, but that was due in large part to our state and local election officials, who I thought did a remarkably good job yesterday amidst all the chaos of making sure that the election was conducted appropriately and communicating out truthful information. 4 years ago, that would not have happened. You just wouldn't have seen the state and local election officials ready to communicate out, like on social media, what the truth was around any issues that were out at polling places. And when they do that, that makes it easier for the social media companies to watch out for any sort of false information that's being put out around voting. So really good job systemically in terms of the defense, I thought, yesterday on election integrity. Now this comes to the tougher part, which is Rachel and I have been, in contact this morning and talking about mobilizations. So there are certain calls to mobilize in US cities. And this is where particularly the Russians piggyback in, but even the Chinese point to the chaos inside the United States, which is there are talks of mobilizing to Washington, D.C. You might have seen reports already this morning of members of the Proud Boys being stabbed in Washington, D.C. And this is creating the tone of mobilizations. One way, there was some misguided, I think, narratives that were in the media last night, which is that people would mobilize last night. People don't know the results. We still don't know the results of the election, so they don't know where to mobilize to or what for. And so this is something that's going to be extremely concerning today. And what's interesting is instead of mobilizing to maybe polling places, it's going to be specific cities. Philadelphia being one that there's a lot of concern about, but also Portland, Oregon, just because of recent history. But most importantly, I think most logically and what we would see is a large-scale mobilization by protesters and counter-protesters of protesters and other groups jumping in to Washington, D.C. And that's really the focal point that we're looking for over the next 24 hours is where do these mobilizations shake out at, and then what are the locations? And I think D.C. is probably number one. Rachel, would you disagree, or you have anything you'd elaborate on that? Because I know she's watching some different feeds than me oftentimes.
No, I think DC is really the focal point, especially if there's contested results, which given the lead up to the election, that's been a central narrative. I think we'll probably see that. Pennsylvania, Philadelphia was a concern, but it seems to have shifted more towards DC.
Yeah, and so it is good news for Philadelphia. I think 24 hours ago, no, 36 hours ago, if you had asked me, I would have been more worried about Philadelphia just because we were concerned around yesterday, election day, and it went off, I think, as good as we could have hoped. And so DC will be the focal point, I think, from here on. In terms of coverage, typical amplification of voter fraud, election rigging, and sowing confusion about victory and declarations. I would say this, there's not much that can be said by Americans or American news outlets, by foreign news outlets that American news outlets aren't also saying. There's pretty consistent confusion. Even between like the BBC and the US media today, they're calling different states in terms of different outcomes. So it's been interesting to watch. Very little, I think, that the foreign media or press can do. And then we'll be watching the reach of this. But overwhelmingly, the Russians are loving this moment of chaos in America because we're divided. And so they will continue to amplify that, and that will not stop through this next period to Inauguration Day, regardless of who wins, and that will continue post-Inauguration Day. So Rachel, anything you would add, because you really contrast the overlap stuff? I mean, Russia's been super quick, but any other context that you would add to it?
Yeah, I would just add that they're really they're trying to play up each candidate's supposed declaration. So, you know, in the US media, we've seen after President Trump's press conference last night, you know, outlets saying he hasn't won yet, we're still counting votes. Whereas in the foreign media, especially the Russian outlets, they're really pushing the chaos of this declaration rather than, you know, we're still counting votes and it's not definitive yet.
That's right. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty remarkable that they're not issuing fake news. There's just so much uncertainty this time around from foreign outlets. That really leads to, if you remember, for those that were on the presentation I did last week with Rachel, and then kind of what we've been talking about is there's 3 periods of disinformation really, and we just finished the first one. And that's the article that I'm working on and Rachel's helping me with today and tomorrow, which is what to look for kind of the rest of the way out, meaning that there's 2 more periods. So if the election was a hockey match for disinformation, we're right at the first intermission, and we're just dropping the puck for the second period right now, meaning that the period from now to Inauguration Day, regardless of the outcome, is going to be extremely chaotic in terms of the information space and knowing what to believe. And so that's going to be a big focus of that, and that uncertainty about what to believe leads to these mobilizations, different groups trying to take advantage of that chaos. And so we're trying to watch what are the agents of influence in the U.S. that are advancing it, that, you know, foreign entities are tapping into, and then, you know, what are the outlets actually saying and doing. The third period will start post-inauguration, just again, depending on the outcome. You're going to see chaos being sowed, and that's because we're so divided as a country. I think if there was anything you saw from the results, at least that have been reported out so far, is that America is about a 50-50 split on most issues. And so just something to look at, you know, moving forward is how these adversaries try and play in our space. Russia will be there through all 3 periods. I think for Iran, they'll be there in a couple periods, just depends on if President Trump wins or not. And for China, they are paving their way around the world. They like what's happening in America, so they can advertise to the rest of the world how unstable America is and how stable the Chinese system essentially is as a world leader. And so with that, Raleigh, I'll go ahead and stop share. We can do questions and any sort of follow-up, and please ask questions to Rachel too. She looks at more stories than I do. I use her as a sponge to soak up all the foreign media and disinformation that's out there. Raleigh, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. So please add your questions and we will get them to Clint and Rachel. We have not a question, but a comment that apparently Philly mobilization is on Independence Park at 1 p.m. I also saw some information about several gatherings planned today around various parts of the city. Can you comment on, you know, if some of our listeners want to go to these things, is that safe to do?
Yeah, I think in a lot of these cases, Raleigh, you know, part of what I was talking about for mobilizations, I want to make clear is we're talking about people with guns, you know, showing up for intimidation purposes and pushing for violence. I think you'll see peaceful protests of many persuasions, you know, around the country today. Those were already pre-planned, and so Rachel and I have even subscribed to their mailing list, so we sometimes get the updates about where to show up at. Rachel is a Philly native; it's got a great network there that she's always, you know, keeping track of. Rachel, would you add anything? I mean, I have not seen any indication to think that they're going to be violent yet. Let me add, Rachel, before you jump in. We're looking for 2 strains really of groups that we worry about. And this is where I think you see really great work by the FBI again, which is you might have heard the term Boogaloo or the Boogaloo Boys, accelerationist white supremacist. the base and Adamwath. And these are groups where if you see them calling for mobilizations, that means show up with guns and shoot people. These are the folks that are accelerationists, means accelerating towards a second civil war. They see that this is the time for change, and the only way to do that is through violence. And so that's the first batch. And if you watch the arrest, the FBI preemptively arrested a member of the base in Michigan, a Boogaloo Boy member in West Virginia yesterday. There were several other arrests around the country. So they did some preemptive action on that. It seems to have worked. So I've not seen that in Philadelphia. Rachel, would you correct me if I'm wrong on that?
No, I think that's right. And like you said, I think we expect to see protests across the country, especially in Philly. The main concern with Philadelphia would just be that there is, as the results are delayed and us getting a definitive answer about who won, people may get antsy about that. And so there may be some protest, counter protest, but no indication of violence yet.
Yeah, I think Raleigh, for the most part, it is safe. And I think if Rachel and I see something in that space, we would definitely let you and FPRI know, if it was concerning. The other part is the militia type groups, but that's not a strong presence in and around the Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area. That's mostly in the southern part of the United States, pockets of Michigan, where they've talked that they won't accept the outcome of the election unless President Trump wins. And so I think that's where most of them seem to be redirecting towards Washington, D.C. now, which is interesting. That wasn't something we anticipated a couple of weeks ago. So in terms of that, I think the third line is the Proud Boys versus Antifa sort of battle, but is not necessarily like a shooting conflict kind of thing like we see with the first two groups potentially. It's a little bit different, and those are somewhat known. That's Portland. That is Philadelphia potentially. But I think most of the protests that we'll see today will be peaceful, for the most part. And I think law enforcement, Homeland Security are prepared for it.
We have a question from Don Carden, who's one of our board members. Please comment on the reliability of the polls compared to the election results.
The polls are worthless. I mean, I think that's what we learned last night. I mean, across the board, Rachel has heard me complain about this. We did not know who was going to vote, and we did not know whose votes were going to be counted and in what way. And I think that was emblematic of the results last night. I talked to people. I talked to people that support President Trump and people that supported former Vice President Biden, and both thought they were going to win in a landslide, right? And so that's not true. Like it is about as 50-50 as you could see. It's pretty remarkable, really, how 50-50 it is, like across the country. And even in terms of popular vote, Biden will win the popular vote, but it's not a landslide by any means. And so, yeah, I think for polling, again, it just shows that when you don't know how turnout will shape out with multiple types of voting, mail-in ballots, ballot box drop-off, absentee, all that sort of stuff, just really hard to figure out what the polls are going to represent. So, yeah, and rural areas in America seem to be not accurately polled whatsoever in terms of turnout. So, yeah, I'm just waiting for the results. I just completely, I don't know why 538 wouldn't shut down today. I mean, they were off 6 to 8%, it seems like, in most states, with their averaging a poll of polls, which is a lot of money going to pollsters that I kind of wonder if they just sat at their house and just filled in the poll themselves, because it's so wildly off. I don't know how you would make much judgments. A lot of campaign money was spent on those polls and investing in places where it probably wasn't even close.
This isn't a question, but would you say the same thing about all the money that went to advertising?
Yes. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, I saw a figure this morning, and the Lincoln Project folks, right, have been very prolific and successful. And for all of the money as a kind of like former GOP advertising group that was spent, turnout for the GOP was higher this year. So I don't know, that's millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on advertising that I find fascinating, right? Like when it all shakes it out, we could have actually maybe paid for a cure for COVID, or provided everybody housing, or paid veterans benefits with all those millions of dollars. Yeah.
We have a question from Ambassador Vershbow, who's on this call. Have we seen any significant difference between what Russian media are telling the domestic audience as compared with external propaganda and disinformation? Have they been preparing the Russian people for a Biden administration, or just focusing on chaos and polarization?
Yeah, so I'll give some, and then Rachel, please chime in with anything I missed off the top of my head. But inside Russia, they have been prepping that a Biden win is going to be the equivalent of World War III. And they even have made movies to that effect in the Donbass region of Ukraine. They've been messaging that pretty consistently in the Russian language space, is that it would be a major debacle and a standoff. I think it's pretty interesting, like how they've been dual messaging in multiple ways. And we've also seen it just, we did it in the presentation previous weeks, but Rachel and I have also seen them doing propaganda focused on election rigging, voter fraud for the political right in America, and the same in terms of the social media space from an outlet called Redfish on the political left, going all the way back to the summer in the George Floyd protest. So everyone gets a batch of narratives that's specifically designed for them. Rachel, would you add anything to that I missed?
So yeah, with the movie and some other things, they have been definitely anti-Biden, portraying a potential Biden administration super negatively. Overall, though, I think they're more, at least to the Russian-speaking population, just denigrating the United States as a whole. So that's COVID, that's like foreign policy issues, and just kind of criticizing the US generally. And also with a lot of near abroad, chaos recently, they're kind of seem to be focusing more on that as opposed to in the English language, RT or Sputnik, where they talk a lot about US politics. The Russian language stuff is far more focused on, the near abroad countries recently.
We have a question from Nick Schifrin of PBS, who thanks for doing this and says it's good to see you all after a long night. You partially answered this, but on Russian state media amplification, is there any evidence that it's effective? Our intel officials here believe it's less prominent than in 2016. And on offensive operations, Nakasone made an extraordinary statement last night. The actions we've taken against adversaries over the past several weeks and months have ensured they're not going to interfere in our elections. That seems very forward-leaning and hard to know. What's your response to that language?
Yeah, so on the first one, in terms of Russian state media amplification, I don't think the amplification is particularly effective this time because Americans are more aware. I would add to that in terms of the amplification that the difference between 2016 and 2020 is now you have officials that are attached with President Trump appearing on Russian state media. And you could go to One American News Network where one of the correspondents came from, I believe, Sputnik News. And so there's kind of been a convergence in the audience space to where it's not some sort of subsurface covert activity as much as it's very much open convergence between Russian state media and parts of the president's audience in terms of what they listen to. Like just the idea of in the Obama or Bush administrations, their own officials appearing on RT on election day or serious is hard to fathom. So I mean, that's a major shift. So I don't think it's the amplification as much as just the convergence in terms of the audiences and what they are listening to and speaking to. In terms of General Nakasone, Nick, I think that refers to, they've said probably for the last year or two, and probably going back to election 2018, they were going to pursue the strategy of persistent engagement, meaning that they're always engaging the adversary with cyber action. And I'm assuming his statement is an extension of that. And it is pretty forward. And I think it is remarkable because yesterday, when we were watching some of what we would call the more peripheral news sites that tend to amplify Russian disinformation, they were pretty quiet. And so in terms of decision calculus, this has always been part of it, which is if there's no consequences, the Russians will continue to go up into the line in which they meet some sort of challenge. And it's like, maybe we're creating some sort of cyber boundary line to a degree related to cyber attacks and disinformation. I don't know that exactly to be the fact, but it seems like something is very different this time around than 2016 for sure, and even from 2018.
I'm going to combine a couple questions, one from Jerry Rubenstein, who is one of our board members. He's asking whether we expect American militias to show up post-inauguration, for instance, if Biden wins, and what the response would be. And we also have from Alan Luxembourg, if we see protests and counter-protests, do you fear that law enforcement will treat the right-wing protesters as tacit allies? So I would say, what can we expect depending on who wins?
Yeah. So let's go with if President Trump wins. We'll start with that. If President Trump wins, you will see mobilizations in a lot of what I assume to be both Washington, D.C. There's kind of counteraction movement there. And Rachel, I'll let you jump in for President Trump, and then I'll do Vice President Biden, and then you can jump in on that one. So we'll break it up into pieces. And so if President Trump wins, you're going to see people out in the streets in a protest fashion pretty consistently, particularly if Biden wins the popular vote. And this is going to create a chain reaction where suddenly the president of the United States half the time wins the minority of the vote. That's over the last 6 elections. That's really bad, just in terms of our democracy. And I think people feel very disenfranchised. This will then, I think, lead to, will you see counter protesters that are the more law and order gun toting situation that we saw in Portland to a degree? And so I'm nervous about that. Rachel, what would you say, anything you would add in terms of President Trump winning?
No, I agree that I think, especially if there's a wider margin between the popular vote, him winning the popular vote or losing the popular vote, excuse me, from 2016, I think we'll see, pretty massive protesting.
And then I would say DC, New York, and then Philadelphia definitely in play. Many cities around the country have already posted, we will show up if Trump takes the election, or steals it, or any sort of this rhetoric. That's going to be significant. If Vice President Biden wins, in that case, the 3% militias, Oath Keeper militias, have already said that unless President Trump wins, we're going to mobilize. And so, oh boy, those are guys with guns that are very serious. Now, I always try and add a little bit to this. Oftentimes these folks say a lot of things. Remember, a lot of celebrities always claim they're going to move to Australia or Canada based on the outcome of the election. They usually never do. So a lot of this is hyperbole, okay, sure. But many of them, I think this time will. They've already put into plan, some things that they want to do. And if they surface in DC, you will see counter protesters surface in response. And I think that's the domino effect that could occur. It seems like Washington, DC is the location. I also am very worried that in Pennsylvania, for example, it could potentially shake out by tonight where Vice President Biden does win. There's allegations of voter fraud, and you see the GOP go to court to contest the results. We see a recount, and in that extended recount, we see people like President Trump saying, you need to descend on Pennsylvania. And in terms of electors, the recount, the polling places, that could be disastrous if that were to occur. And you will immediately see counter protesters in response. I know Southern Jersey has its own distro list to mobilize to Philadelphia in response to pro-Trump protest. Rachel, you want to elaborate more just in terms of what you've seen on the Pennsylvania side, because you know it really well.
Yeah, and I think in general, one of the concerning components of this is there seems to be a convergence between, declarations that they will mobilize, but also kind of like a buy-in to this narrative that the election is rigged, there's going to be voter fraud, and a Biden win would mean that occurred, that there was fraud, especially with regard to mail-in ballots. And we've seen that, in the websites that we watch, foreign and domestic, that are, on the fringe side, that's the narrative that they're really hammering. And so it seems that some of these groups have picked that up and believe it. And so I think that stated belief in some of these cases is concerning. If they're saying they're going to mobilize, it seems to be because of that reason.
We have another question from Murray Levin, who's also a board member. Was there any evidence, this is going back to election day, was there any evidence of voter turnout was affected by these disinformation attempts?
I have not seen it, Raleigh. I mean, it seemed like people were early voting in the 100 million early votes. Even yesterday, I did not see it on broad scale. There was one attempt that we saw in Dearborn, Michigan, to kind of scare people from going to the polling places, which was a text message campaign. There were a couple other spots where we saw traffic take off, but I can't say for sure, and it doesn't look like to be sizable amounts of people not showing up due to disinformation. I think that's a really positive sign that from the media to the institutions, the social media companies, state and local election officials, I thought, considering everything that's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, recent protests, it went off just about as good as we could hope in terms of conduct. Rachel, do you have any to add?
No, I agree.
Yeah. We have a question from Golveda Oscar, and I think it's a little too broad maybe for your expertise, although I'll give it to you anyway, which is, what is the validation process of mail-in ballots, if there is any in place? But let me just, beyond that, ask, you know, based on what you've seen in this election in terms of malign influence and disinformation, both to skew people's thinking and intimidate people, which you say there hasn't worked. But what reforms would you recommend if you were, for instance, testifying down on the Hill and a senator asks you, how can we fix this and make this a more fair, you know, transparent election with eliminating disinformation?
Yeah, so in terms of mail-in votes, I have no idea what the validation process is. Yeah, I just hope it's not hanging chads. That's the only thing I hope for. I don't want to see a scene again from 20 years ago like that. So hopefully it's better than that. In terms of disinformation, the Honest Ads Act for social media should be passed immediately. This is still confounding why people can lie in their ads on social media but not on other media platforms. You know, that does not make any sense. The second one is that you as a candidate or an elected official will not use foreign assistance in the election. In this case, it's been very clear, going back at least a year, that there were foreign entanglements or enticements going on. Rudy Giuliani, he's appeared on TV just more overt and in our face this time as compared to Paul Manafort, which we were talking about in 2016, you know, with Konstantin Kilimnik and the Mueller investigation. So that just needs to stop immediately in terms of dealing with that. And there was a bill that was put up, and it was somewhat tied to the Election Integrity Act. And I think it was both Warner and Burr supported it in the Senate Intel Committee, but it has not been passed. So those would be the two big ones. I think the third one is, I've seen a lot of this sort of crying about censored speech and free speech on social media. And that just comes down to, look, make regulations and the companies will enforce them. And so if there's something you want censored or sort of dealt with in terms of political speech, then the Senate and the House can make a bill and pass it and then push that out to them in terms of what to police. The EU has done this on hate speech, for example, and the companies will comply. But right now they're just kind of left in this hanging balance of, I'm trying to not let foreign interference in the election occur on my platform, and the politicians are beating me up for censoring certain pieces of content that come through that we think, you know, could be connected with foreign disinformation. And at the same point, the platforms are making a truckload of cash off of political ads that are done on their platform. So I kind of don't want to hear it from elected officials anymore about their worries about their speech being censored when they're dumping a few $100 million in election into those same social media platforms. You know, they need to decide. They can't play it both ways, I don't think.
This question from me. We haven't talked, or you haven't talked very much about China, and I might also give a shout out to Jacques Delisle's article we published last Friday on Purple State China, which basically comes down and says China's being very careful and not really it's not obvious which of the two candidates they would select. But play that out a little bit. Have we seen any activity by China? And what do you envision, how would they react depending on who becomes the president, and what would they do?
So actually, I'm going to let Rachel start that. That's okay, Raleigh, because she was doing the China media, and then I'll take it in conclusion. So Rachel, in terms of the overt stuff we've been tracking the last year and a half, what's your take on China's general interest in our election?
They don't seem to care very much. They talk about the US generally and the US system, democracy, capitalist system is, in their view, not as good as the Chinese system. But they don't talk about US internal politics the way the Russians do, or even the Iranians on their state outlets. We saw maybe 1 or 2 articles on the Global Times that were arguably a little favorable for Biden, but even that I think is, it's negligible. They really don't seem to, promote one candidate over the other. They will denigrate President Trump, but it's more of a function of criticizing the US as opposed to criticizing him as a candidate most of the time.
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. And the number 2 target of China's news is Mike Pompeo, because he is Secretary of State. It's very state to state in terms of their media. And so if you don't watch it every day, you could misinterpret it as election related. It was really just like, he's the president, we're going to bash him. And Pompeo's the Secretary of State, we're going to bash him. And if they were replaced, I think they will continue to target away in the same manner.
I would actually add one more thing, Clint. After we saw Biden select Senator Harris as his running mate, they really criticized her as well. So we've even seen, pretty negative coverage from China about Harris, but that was mostly because of policy stances that she's taken with regard to Chinese issues. So, criticizing them for messaging on Xinjiang and the Hong Kong protests. So it really is more about the foreign policy, it seems.
Yeah, and Raleigh, if I can add, just in terms of social media space, like we've really been hunting for this because, just being honest, the administration has tried to play up this Chinese interference angle, and it doesn't add up, like in terms of any of the ways that we look at it. In fact, when we watch it in the overt space, there might be a slight favorability to Biden. And you will see that they mostly say that because they see Biden as consistent, and if it has a consistent policy, and they can track and organize against that policy strategically because they're always thinking very long run. However, in some other spaces, subsurface and in social media, there's strong pro-Trump support in China. And they like Trump for several reasons. One, they don't like his sparring at times on trade and financial space, but there's a huge trade-off, which is around the world, the U.S. has basically removed itself from the international landscape, and it's opened up doors for China to really pave a path around the world. We see them extremely aggressive in the Pacific Rim, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, heavy pushing a Belt and Road throughout Asia and Africa, even into Europe and some European countries. China's made massive strides over the last 4 years as U.S. has really pushed away from NATO and the EU and really kind of tamped down the UN and other sort of buffers, these alliances, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So they like that. So they're maybe willing to accept a constant or inconsistent beat up from President Trump without any real policy gains in order to make paths around the world. And they all, it seems in some of the discussions I had with some folks in Taiwan, they always knew this day would come anyways. And so they're more thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the road, I think, for the most part.
Yeah. So you haven't seen a big reaction to, the China virus allegations or anything like that?
No, and for the most part, that's one of the places where China's taken on a more Russia-style disinfo, which is patient zero came from America. The U.S. couldn't handle the virus, but we could. It wasn't that big of a deal. We took care of it because we're a stable country. They're using that as sort of like your democracy is inferior to attack back at the United States.
I have another question from Ambassador Vershbow. Have there been any more evidence of Iranian disinformation or dirty tricks, like the purported impersonation of the Proud Boys, or on the latter, many people were not impressed with the ODNI's case on that?
Yeah, the Iranian disinfo, they did one on Tammy Duckworth back in the summer where they made like Adam Ronsley has done some really great writing there from Philadelphia and, works with FPRI, really excellent work. The Iranians are really scatterdash and all over the place and pretty aggressive. And so they show their hand a lot and they make a lot of mistakes, but they also don't seem to really care. In terms of the assessment of the ODNI, the ODNI could have marched out 15 times in the last 2 months and talked about different foreign disinformation or interference in the election and made a similar or stronger case, particularly in the case of Russia. They could have done 8 press conferences just on Russia, but they didn't. So that was selection bias. What he said was true, that it was a provocation by Iran, but that provocation by Iran or allegations of China launching text messages are a sign of weakness in terms of influence, meaning that if that was not a complex operation, you or I could download all of the registrations, they're oftentimes public, of voters in a certain district and send them spam emails that say anything. And so it's not particularly complex. It actually shows weakness vis-a-vis Russia, because Russia actually has their tentacles into the United States. They have surrogates that are advocating on their behalf. They have a network where the administration sends people to two times in 3 days show up on RT. You see, overt amplification out of Russia. So there's a bridge into the U.S. for Russia, and they would rather use that than a silly email campaign that didn't achieve any effect and was caught. I think the other thing it really shows, the reason that ODNI could walk out so quickly is because our sensors on Iran at a technical level, I think, are much more sophisticated in terms of how we can do detection. That was pretty good response time for the U.S. government.
Yeah. And as some of you may remember, it was just about a year ago that Iran spoofed the FPRI website in order to spread disinformation in the Middle East. It was relatively unsophisticated. Not sure how successful it was, but it seems like a pretty typical attack by them. We have another question from Ambassador Vershbow. I already answered that, excuse me. We have one from Carlos River, and I'm going to pair it with another from our board member, Jerry Rubenstein. Carlos asked, in the case of a judicial dispute, what are the perspectives? And Jerry asked, many states have election regulations governing the right to a recount. Do these exist in Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin? Would the federal courts have a role in ignoring these criteria for recounts? I know neither of you are attorneys, so maybe if you can interpret this in the context of what you've been studying and looking at all year.
Yeah, so I definitely don't know, Raleigh, like on the recounts of all those states and the process exactly, so I wouldn't want to misspeak. I assume that they will be contested. It seems like lawyers have been lining up in every state for both sides to try and deal with these actions. What I would say, though, is in the scenario that President Trump loses all 3 of those states, it would be pretty tough, I think, to continue that legal campaign, just because there are combinations of those with Arizona and Nevada, for example, that make Pennsylvania not relevant anymore. So I think they may get into a weird spot if they try and pursue that, where they're trying to overturn results in multiple states that aren't, really on a recount going to surface that way. Really don't know how that will go. And I don't think we'll know until Rachel and I were discussing it earlier today. It seems like 7 p.m. tonight, maybe around that time for Pennsylvania might be a first sort of cut, and then could go on well into tomorrow, but then it could also fall with a domino effect of other combinations of states differently, to where we know maybe before Pennsylvania even comes in. So I just don't know. Rachel may even know now if she has a feed up, because I think some of the results are coming back around noon for Wisconsin. So may have happened. Some of this may have happened while we're on this call.
Yeah. A lot has been said about our electoral system and the fact that it's so chaotic and it takes so long to get the results, and there's so many opportunities. Last week we had a event with the ambassador to the Estonian ambassador to the United States. And he said their voting's done. It takes about 5 minutes because, well, they're a small country. It's all done online. But do you see an indication that our foreign adversaries like this system we have, because it is so chaotic and it gives them an opportunity to play around? Just a comment, I would think it would be strongly in their interest to keep our system the way it is.
Yep, Raleigh, if I were a foreign adversary, I love the Electoral College. It's like the greatest thing ever, right? Because if you're doing targeting, imagine if you had to target the nationwide popular vote as a foreign adversary. It would be almost impossible to do any sort of manipulation on scale that would affect an outcome. And you wouldn't be able to carve up the US electorate in such a way on issues in terms of influence and disinformation and propaganda. You just wouldn't be able to achieve it because every campaign would have to take on some local dynamics more. I will give you an example. I'm in upstate New York. No one ever campaigns here ever. And there are New York is considered a Democratic state. There are tons of Republicans up here who never get a visit, right? Like for any reason. And that's just broad-based disenfranchisement of millions and millions of Americans just based on what state they reside in and where the tipping and balancing goes. And so, yeah, I think it's remarkable at the end of the day that it's always 6 to 8 states. We know it far out. You can watch the campaigns dump hundreds of millions of dollars into these states. You can even go all the way back to the primary process with Iowa. And I'm from Missouri, and I think Iowa's great, but Iowa sets up precedents for what candidates can even compete to become the president that are nonsensical, ultimately in the end, where a lot of individuals could never potentially run for president or for office. So yeah, I think our system is ideal for disenfranchisement, loss of hope, and for interference and really denigration. I mean, Vladimir Putin says it all the time himself, like, your electoral college is not a democracy. What are you, making jabs at me? Those kinds of statements, and he is correct.
Yeah. What about the local races? Have you seen any foreign involvement to try to sway, the Senate or the House races?
One that I know about. It doesn't mean that, well, I should say two. So if you remember Rohrabacher in California in 2018, there was a specific example of that where there was some hacking done against one of his, I don't know if it was a primary challenger or opponent, but they were aware of it and they caught it. This time around, an interesting one that Rachel and I have seen is one of the outlets declares being tied to the Russian SVR in the New York Times had an article written by an American that was about Evelyn Farkas, who used to be working at the Department of Defense. I think she was a deputy undersecretary, something like that, on Eurasia. So staunch Russia opponent. She was running for Congress here in Westchester, just south of me. And that article from Strategic Culture was copied, pasted, and appeared in the Yonkers Tribune. I think it's Yonkers Tribune as an op-ed. So that is pretty direct in terms of like the disinformation space. And that speaks to a local newspaper probably not knowing that Strategic Culture Foundation is in Moscow and not in the United States. And the author might be from New York, but not really what it seems. Yeah.
Did it then get picked up and spread all over the place?
Yeah, it actually traveled a good bit in the local sort of news environment, which was, very typical Russia Gate, Mueller, this and that, and she was tied up in it. I don't know that it affected the outcome because I'm not familiar with the dynamics of the primary process in that district, but yeah, it does show that they make an effort. I don't think they do it routinely though. Local elections are much more difficult to interfere with from afar because it does come down to popular vote. It's harder to game or switch votes and that sort of thing. But they don't ignore it. They are paying attention, over time.
Yeah. Another of our board members, Don Carden, asked a comment and a question. Philadelphia police are very concerned with Antifa as leaders of the outsiders that format the riots. Can you comment on Antifa? I note that the president and the Republicans have also talked a lot about Antifa.
Sure.
Are they really a big threat, and is what they do being used by foreign adversaries?
Yeah, so I'll throw out a bunch of stuff about Antifa. So Antifa, just so folks that aren't familiar, means anti-fascist. So I was teaching law enforcement 3 years ago, and this Antifa thing kind of came out of nowhere. It was over and over and over again. It was Antifa, Antifa. And when I'd ask people who the Antifa were in their town, no one could name who they were. And so it was an interesting kind of dynamic of how the media sort of blew it up. So probably 2 years ago, I was working with some terrorism researchers, and we were going to testify at the Senate Homeland Affairs Committee last year. And we had to struggle to find people that were actual Antifa to study. And it's primarily in Portland, Seattle, but it comes out of that space. There are all sorts of violent protesters across the political spectrum. Antifa becomes kind of this bulk label for everybody on the political left, which is interesting. There are some other small groups that I think are far more violent. I always note to people that if they have Antifa showing up in their town, it may be because they also have FIE showing up in their town, which are fascists, because one is there to counter the other. So they don't sort of like form out of nowhere. I've seen it here in New York as well. And I was a new agent in Portland, Oregon, and those protesters have been there since the WTO riots of the late 1990s. And we used to see them every time someone was arrested, they would just change what they wrote on their sign and they would show up to the federal building and sort of protest. That's like a pretty consistent scene for protest movements. So yes, there are Antifa. There's not as many as you might perceive based on media accounts of Antifa. They generally are not as violent as some of the other groups that I track, like Boogaloo, which worries me. Those guys just show up to shoot. And oftentimes they're there as a demonstration to kind of get into fistfights with the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys bring Antifa and vice versa. Antifa brings Proud Boys, and it's sort of like a match between the two in terms of protest.
We have another question from David Marshall, and you partially answered this, but I'll kick it out there. David is another of our board members. With socially active children and grandchildren affiliated with Quaker traditions living in Philadelphia and likely to participate in protesting, what would you advise as a parent?
Yeah, I would say if you're in crowds, wear a mask, right? Because this is COVID-19. I think the second is don't go alone, right? You go with friends and in a group. I think that is what you see in terms of safety. If you've watched any of the videos from Kenosha, Wisconsin, I think that's highly indicative of lone people, young people showing up alone, in protests that are highly chaotic and disorganized and under policed to a degree just due to manpower. I think the other thing is if you see people participating in violence, one, get away, but if you can't get away, try and encourage them not to. And that's what's highly reflective, I think, of the Portland protest, where you had everything from moms linking arms, around buildings to legitimate Antifa guys with bats and sticks trying to do property damage, to looters and criminal organizations tied into right-wing sort of Proud Boys and other militias trying to create confrontations. And so if you see that, just remove yourself from it altogether, I think is the best advice. And I think separately is, if you see people show up in the middle of your protests that are trying to instigate violence, well, the most successful protests I've seen have turned against their own protesters that have pushed to violence. So if they can be part of that, I think that's a good solution as well.
Yeah. You haven't talked a lot about COVID. COVID clearly is, the biggest or one of the biggest issues we've dealt with as a country this year, for many decades, really. And it was an election issue, but did our foreign adversaries use COVID as a way to influence the election and or divide our population?
Yeah, so in terms of COVID, I think there's a couple things. For foreign disinformation, Russia and China and Iran have all pushed a lot of it. Russia's has been a little bit more prolific in terms of spreading around the world and convincing people. This is usually the bioweapon narratives that you see. It's a bioweapon from one country or another country. I've seen people in my local hometown, and this kind of goes to Nick's question there in the beginning, which is in terms of amplification, I've seen those stories from Sputnik News and RT show up in my high school classmates' Facebook post since March, which is pretty crazy that, that's their information source on COVID-19, which is a little bit alarming. In terms of COVID, I kind of wonder if when all of the election analysis comes out that the vote last night was who voted worried about deaths from COVID versus who voted because they don't like lockdowns and masks. I think it could actually be that simple, to a degree. When you listen to people's argumentation, oftentimes it's two different realities around how COVID should be responded to and characterizations of it. If interested and you're waiting for results today, the New York Times did a fascinating discussion of COVID and the elections, a local race in Wisconsin this week, and a town divided between two candidates, one that was upset about lockdowns and masks, and the other who was like, we need to shut down. And they're both restaurant owners in the same town, same area in Wisconsin. Fascinating if you get a chance to listen to it. I think it came out on Tuesday. And I'm really curious how, when we get down to it at the end of this election, how much of it in a lot of these states is just literally how you feel about the pandemic response and what you believe should be the appropriate response for it.
We have a last question, if you could maybe use it also as a springboard to wrap up. It's from Alfonso Diaz, and I'm going to summarize because it's long. He basically, I think the gist of what he's saying is that foreign disinformation, foreign influence operations are nothing new. We ourselves as a country have done them. I think you can go back to 1948 in the Italian election, in which CIA was very prominent in defeating the communists there. And so he asked, I would ask, it's nothing new. We saw it with Clint in '96 and the Indonesian guy whose name I can't remember right now, but what's different now? Or is it just more of the same with different technology?
I think it's technology plus money. This will be 2021 and beyond, is that, and this is what I worry, regardless of who wins tonight or tomorrow, whatever, or whenever this happens, whenever we figure out who the winner is that the US government doesn't have its head wrapped around the reality of what's going on today. Meaning, in foreign policy, if you're operating in Africa, you're operating against influence of the Chinese government and Russian oligarchs who have their own private military company and disinformation machine. Excellent point with Steve Bannon and the G News, which is part of the GWOW network of disinfo. Those are all third-party actors that have major influence and major resources behind them. So I agree. I've listened to, I'm deeply frightened that Biden wins. That they will try and rewind to the Obama era in terms of America. And I read, some of the pieces in Foreign Affairs that, are Vice President Biden's article. We know who wrote it probably. It's his foreign policy staff. And it sounds like a fantasy world when I read it in terms of how the world operates. Talking about the United Nations next year, give me a break, that's not going to happen. Talking about rebuilding NATO and the European Union and, recreating the system of the 1990s, that is just not going to happen. And really, I was lucky enough to do the podcast with Michael Morrell last week. And, the conclusion I came to is the US will not regain its footing until there's unity or a majority around what the US stands for and wants to advance internally and around the world. And so that is not clear. And it does not seem to me that we have a real good handle on how money, influence, and even force is being applied around the world right now. And we're not going to be fighting nation states per se. We'll be fighting ourselves first, and then we'll have to navigate forward from there. once we kind of come to some sort of footing on the ground. So yeah, I agree, I think, with Alfonso in terms of his comment that I'm a little nervous when I listen to him talk that there's a little bit too much graduate school, Dartmouth, Harvard, Yale class coming through in our policy edicts here, and not enough reality of the cold truth about money and information being weaponized against us.
Clint, this has been fantastic. Although a little depressing, is there anything positive you can leave with our audience as we sign off?
I can. I mean, Russia, Iran, and China did not have a significant impact in our election. We should be very happy about that. And the institutions were there this time. When I briefed the Russia stuff in 2015 and 16, no one cared at all. And that's a major change. We should be very happy how that went. Second is how great state and local election officials did during a pandemic, running multiple types of elections, right? So they've never done that before. They're usually not paid, or they're paid very little, right? And so they did an in-person, a mail-in ballot. They're counting the votes. They've got crazy people screaming at them. You don't have to worry about intimidation. They did excellent last night. And so all through yesterday and even into today so far, I think they will do the best that they can. And so that is also good news. And I think the third thing is we saw no one shot or a bombing or anything at a polling place or a mobilization yesterday. So 3 positive signs that all of our worst fears may not come to fruition.
And large voter turnout.
Large voter turnout, huge.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that positive note and an enlightening discussion, Rachel and Clint. We'll have to have you back again.
Tomorrow, right?
Yeah, not tomorrow. So thank you. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our supporters and our board members who are online. We can't do it without your support, and we really do appreciate it. Stay tuned, stay safe, and we'll be back. Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Molly.